Before we start analyzing the epistemically neutral senses in which scientists use the word law, it'll be helpful to have a few examples that illustrate the features that we'll talk about in more detail later. It's also important to look at examples from a variety of fields, not just physics, because one of the debates about laws is whether there are any genuine examples of laws outside of physics. There are lots of empirical regularities that we've discovered in biology and psychology and other social sciences. But the question is whether any of these regularities meet the criteria for being a genuine law. And that depends on what you mean by the term law. So in this video, we'll look at some examples of candidate laws from biology and psychology. I find all of these very interesting in their own right, but the point of these examples is that it makes it easier to have a conversation about the concept of a law in science and the role of laws in science. Okay, here is the Wikipedia page entry for biological rules, which gives a list of empirical regularities that biologists would describe as either rules or laws of biology. The first line defines a biological rule or biological law as a generalized law, principle, or rule of thumb formulated to describe patterns observed in living organisms. The page lists about 20 such rules or laws. Here's one. It's called Bergmann's Rule. It says that within a group of organisms that have a common ancestor, like all the bear species or bear populations, the larger species are found in colder regions and the smaller species are found in warmer regions. The rule applies to many species of mammals and birds, but there are exceptions. The textbook explanation for this pattern is that the larger animals have a lower surface area to volume ratio, which means that they radiate less body heat per unit of mass. So in a colder climate, that's an advantage because you want to conserve body heat. In hot climates, you have the opposite problem. You want to dissipate heat as quickly as possible, otherwise you'll overheat. Here's another one that's related. Allen's Rule. Warm-blooded animals adapted to cold climates have shorter limbs and body appendages than animals adapted to warm climates. So a desert fox or a desert rabbit will have larger ears and longer legs than an Arctic fox or an Arctic rabbit. This is another adaptation for heat regulation. If you're rounder with fewer appendages sticking out, you're exposing less surface area, so you'll conserve body heat better. And if you're in a desert and you need to dissipate body heat, you want more body surface exposed to the air. So you'll adapt by having more body parts sticking farther out of you. There are a lot of fascinating scaling laws in biology that relate body size or mass to some physiological variable. This one is Kleber's law. I'm not sure if it's Kleber or Kleiber. It relates total metabolic rate to body mass. So metabolic rate is the amount of energy an organism uses per unit of time. Larger organisms need more energy to survive than smaller organisms, so that's not surprising. What is surprising is the precise way that it scales. If an elephant is 1,000 times more massive than a mouse, say, then if it used 1,000 times as much energy per unit of time as a mouse, then we'd say that metabolic rate scales linearly with mass. Kleber found that this relation doesn't scale linearly. As mass goes up, metabolic rate goes up, but it goes up less and less the larger the organism becomes. So organisms seem to become more efficient at using energy the larger they get. And he found that metabolic rate scales with mass in a very particular way. So metabolic rate is proportional to the mass of the organism raised to the power of 3/4. This graph actually uses a logarithmic scale. So the mass units increase by a power of 10 at every interval. And this logarithmic scale straightens out what would otherwise be a curved graph that rises and then levels off. And the slope of the straight line on this scale is a measure of the value of this scaling exponent, 3/4 or 0.75. Actually, one of the longest standing puzzles in biology was how to explain where this 3/4 scaling exponent comes from, why that number rather than some other number. The leading theory today is that it's a combination of the physics and geometry of thermal regulation, and the fact that the branching structure of the circulatory system of all organisms has a fractal structure. So it looks the same at all scales. So theorists have actually been able to derive these scaling exponents from these kinds of mathematical assumptions about how thermal energy is dissipated in living organisms. It's quite fascinating. Now let's look at a couple of examples of laws or candidate laws from psychology. Psychologist Carl Teigen provided a helpful way into this topic in a 2002 article. He did a keyword search of psychology journal abstracts from 1900 to 1999 and looked for examples where people talked about psychological laws. And he ranked the most commonly mentioned laws. So these are the top 8. You've got the name of the law, often named after the person who first documented it, the date of first publication, and the number of mentions in the literature search of abstracts. A lot of these are from early studies in psychophysics and perceptual psychology, and laws that came out of the behaviorist movement in psychology that focused on stimulus response patterns. So Weber's law, for example, says that the size of a just noticeable difference in a stimulus is a constant proportion of the original stimulus value. So, for example, if I'm lifting a 5-pound weight in my hand, the question is, what's the smallest weight I can add before I can perceive a difference in the weight? That's the delta I. That's the smallest noticeable difference. I is the original weight, so 5 pounds. Then you can do this for 6 pounds, 7 pounds, 10 pounds. And the x-axis is the starting weights. The y-axis is the just noticeable differences for each of the starting weights. And it turns out this relationship scales linearly. So the heavier the starting weight, the larger the difference has to be before you'll notice a difference. So that's Weber's law. Stephen's power law describes a power law relationship between the magnitude of a physical stimulus and the intensity or the strength that people feel within a certain range of values. So I is the magnitude of a physical stimulus, like the actual luminosity of a light source, or the voltage of an electric shock, or the air pressure produced by sound. So that's plotted on the x-axis. And the y-axis is the magnitude of the stimulus as we perceive it. It's the sensation that it induces in us. So how bright the light appears to us, or how much pain is associated with a given electrical shock, or how loud the sound is to our ears. So Stephen showed that these relations follow the general form of a power law, but the value of the power law exponent and the shape of the curve is different for different types of stimulus. So on this graph, for example, the red curved line is for electrical shock. As the voltage increases, the pain that we experience increases exponentially. The blue curve is the brightness of a light source. And the perceived brightness actually levels off as luminosity of the light source increases. And the black line is the perceived length of a rod as a function of the actual length of the rod. And the perceived length scales linearly with length as we should expect. We'll do one more. The matching law. It's number 3 on the list. This is a conditioning law in behaviorist psychology. It basically says that our preferences for different choice options are determined by the relative amounts of reinforcement we've been exposed to for each choice option. Obviously, it would take a long while to explain all of these in detail, but for our purposes, none of these details matter. What matters is that these laws describe regularities that are predictive within certain domains and ranges. And in almost every case, they're given a mathematical formulation, a mathematical expression that describes the functional relationships between the key variables. Now, the interesting thing about what Carl Teigen was actually investigating when he did this review is how the frequency of law references in the psychological literature has declined over the years. Psychologists have become more and more reluctant to use the term law to describe these kinds of regularities. And this is largely because most of these regularities have exceptions and are only predictive within a certain domain and range of application. The standard conception of a law of nature, as we'll see, is that a law of nature has no exceptions. So today, scientists in fields like biology and psychology and the social sciences are much more hesitant to use the language of laws. And this inspires people, including scientists and philosophers of science, to occasionally write articles engaging with this question of whether there are any genuine laws in the life sciences or in the social sciences. Now, the background context for this question is, whether it's explicit or not, is how the regularities that show up in the life sciences and the social sciences compare with the regularities in physics. So, for the sake of comparison, in the next video, we'll look at some classic examples of laws from astronomy and physics.